Okay, so today we are going to take a look at something really interesting, and that is custom form validation when it comes to Angular. So let me show you really quick what we'll be implementing, and remember what you learned here, make sure you teach others that you can be able to grow together. Taking a quick look at this form that I just filled in, we see that everything checks out, and so I can be able to submit the form. And if you submit the form, we should see all the fields here, and then you get this nice notification. So what happens when the fields are invalid? For example, if we add unsupported character in the username field, we get this error message. For the email, if we add a domain that is not supported, for example, gmail.com, we see an error, okay? All right. So here in the password field, if we remove one character, we see two errors. The first one, passwords do not match, and the other one is that individual checks for the passwords have not been met. The first one is that the password length must be at least 8 characters. The other one is that the password must contain at least one of these symbols. So that sounds really interesting to implement, and without further ado, let's get started. So because in this tutorial we are going to be using reactive forms, the first thing we have to do is to head over to our app component, because that's the component which will be having our form. And now I want you to look at the import section. So here, all we need to do is to first of all import reactive forms module. This will make it possible for us to have reactive forms in our app component HTML. And the other thing we will need is ng class. This we will need so that we can actually add custom styles based on the different states of the form fields. Then we will also require ngIf. The reason we need this is so that you can be able to conditionally display the errors. We don't want to always show the errors. We want to show the errors when given form states have been met. Then ng template outlet. This one we will use so that we can actually make it so easy for us to have minimal duplication of code, and we will see that later on. And then ng4, we will use this when it comes to actually displaying the checks that have been made for the password field. And the reason we have all these imports is because our app component is a standalone component. All right, so let's continue on to our app component. So the first variable that we have here, we see that it's a public variable. Why is it public? It's public because we will need it, yeah? We will need to use it in the app component HTML, because we will be having two-way data binding between the app component and the app component HTML, so that when a change happens in the app component HTML, it will be persisted in this public member variable of the app component, so that it's going to be possible for us to actually log out the value of the form whenever the user hits the submit button. Okay. All right. So let's expand this and see what we have inside here. The first thing that you see is that we are giving this member variable a type, and that type is of type form group. And the form group, we have imported it from Angular Forms. So we simply create a new form group, and this form group will have its own internal state. And this internal state is what we'll be updating as we make changes to our form in the app component HTML. So you notice that we have it created as an object. It receives a parameter, which is an object, the first parameter. And this parameter is actually a key value mapping, whereby the keys are the names of your form fields, yeah, which are actually called form controls, and then the value that these fields have, or these fields are initialized to, are actually form controls. Okay, so you can, for example, in this case, we have a username, and this username is a new form control, and it's initialized to an empty value. Then it also has a username validator, and we will see validators later on. So this is how you simply create a new form control and you initialize it inside your form group. Okay, all right, the same goes to the email, the password, and the confirm password. And then when we expand this part here, you see we have another array here. This array is what will actually accept other validations which are actually global to this form. In this case, we call it a password validator, and we will see why in a few minutes. The other member variable that we have, and it's also public, is this password validation checks. Why do we have this one? So we expand it and we see that it's an array. Remember, we said we will be looping through the validators for the password. That's why we have it as an array. Then it accepts key and label as the property. Each and every item in this array will be having a key and a label, and we will see why this is needed. So the key, for example, in this case, invalid length, then we have the label for that specific error that has occurred. All right. Okay. Then we have this part here where we show confirmation, and all this one does is that it displays for us this nice notification right here. Okay. All right. Finally, here we see a method called onFormSubmit, and all this does is that it listens for the submit action by the user. So with that said, let's jump over to our app component and we see how all these public member variables and public methods connect and work together with the app component HTML. All right, so opening these two side by side, we start here. So expanding the form, we see that we are going to bind our sign-up form to a form group directive, and this makes it possible for us to actually make changes and update the state of our sign-up form. Okay, so the other binding that's going to happen is going to be an event emitter, whereby we have ng submit event which will be emitted whenever this form is submitted. And when this event is emitted, the method that you are going to call is our onFormSubmit method, which is this one here. All right, so the other thing we are seeing is that this show confirmation. This is a simple ng if whereby we just show the confirmation only when the user submits the form. And finally, for the password validation checks, the part I want you to focus on and actually take note of is this section right here. So here you see what we are doing is that we are looping through our password validation checks. We are displaying them. That is okay. However, the key thing here is this part. Okay, and this is simply what our ng class will be doing. It will be setting this field as valid or not. The most important part is this section. All right, and we will see why this structure is needed just in a few minutes. What we are going to be checking is that if the sign up form has an error and the error happens to be the key, remember our keys, for example, invalid length, missing uppercase, and so forth. If this is the case, then we check. If not error, then the field is valid. But if error, then the field is invalid. I believe that is clear. As for the other fields, for example, the username, all we are going to be doing is simply this. We have this section right here. The first thing we are going to check is that has the username field, okay, been updated? Is it dirty? And does it have errors, so that we can be able to show the appropriate error. Remember, we have two types of errors. For example, for the username has to be required, and the username also must contain a supported character. So that's why we have all this section wrapped in a NGE first. Okay. All right. The same also applies to our email section right here. All right. However, for our password fields, because first of all, remember, in as much as the password fields must actually meet certain criteria, the most important thing is that they should be the same. That is why we have this ng template. You remember the import that we made for ng template? This is where we'll be using it. If we control find, we see that it's used in two places. The first place is in the upper password field, and the second place is in the confirm password field. All right, so this will make sure that when there is an error, and if we expand it, we should see something like this. We have to make sure that the fields that are affected are the password fields, in this case password and confirm password. And then the error that we are looking for is whether the sign up form has an error, that is passwords do not match. Okay, all right. So the next thing before we jump over to our validators is I want you to understand how the field binding actually happens. Not the form binding, because you already talked about the form binding. The field binding, because how will we know that we are touching the password field, the confirm password field, the email field, or the username field? It's so easy, and all you need to do is to add this part here, form control name, and this will actually point to the actual field in the object of your form group. You remember this field here? Right here. Okay, username, email, password, confirm password. The names, they have to be the same. So form control name, it should be username for the username field, and then it should be email for the email field, and so forth. Okay, so now let's finally jump over to our sign-up validators. Remember, you can have so many types of validators. It's up to you. But in our case, because it's a sign-up form, all we need to do is to simply create sign-up validators and have them in a place that is easy for us to not only update, but also understand what our team members are actually making changes to. So that is why we have it created right here as sign-up validators. So before we even expand this, let us quickly understand the syntax of custom validators when it comes to Angular reactive forms. So let's use this simple mock that we have here. The first thing is that you have to understand that custom validators, they are functions. They are just normal functions. That means they are callable, and it also means that you can pass in your parameter here as you see fit, the parameter that you want maybe to work with in the scope of this validator, okay? Then it has to be a validator function that actually gets to return something. And in the return part, you notice that the first section, this return section, accepts a parameter, and this parameter is of a type of abstract control. That means it can be an individual form control field, and it can also be the whole form, okay? Then it also returns something, and the thing that it returns is a union type, whereby we can have validation errors or we can have null, okay? If we have validation errors returned, then that is where we'll be seeing the errors on the UI. And if we have null, that means that everything checked out based on our validation check that we have right here. That means the form will be valid. So whenever you return validation errors, that means that form is invalid. But if you return null, that means that the form is valid. So starting off with our username validator, expanding it, we see that it's following the same syntax as the one that we have just talked about right here. We are going to be accepting no parameters for this one. We don't need any parameters for our username, but we must return something, and the return that you are going to return is the same: validation errors or null, and also the control right here is actually the username field itself, okay? All right, then here is where our logic goes. Remember, this logic here, it can change to be anything that you want, but for our case, we have this specific check that we are making. All you need to do is to make sure that you always return, because if we remove this part, we see an error because we are neither returning validation errors nor null. So make sure that you always return something. And the other thing, I left a tip for you guys here. Remember, the error object that you are returning, in this case, in this section here, it must actually have value. You can't have it like this. For example, error object username is required empty, because this will be treated as null, and you can't have it as false also, because it will be treated as not true. And if it's treated as not true, that means the clause for showing the error. You remember the ng ifs that we have right here? In this section, the clause for showing that error will not actually be displayed, all right? And the users, they will never see any errors at all. All right, so let's take a look at how we are doing our validation. The first part is that we are going to say, if there is no control value, yeah, then the username is required. This error is what will be appended to our form, and then we are going to say it's true, so that when we come to our HTML and we expand our username, here we should see that if we get the username field, remember the error will only be specific to the username control, all right? So that's why we are doing this ng if part. So we are saying sign up form, we get the username, and then we check if it has an error of username is required. If this is the case, then we display the error, and then if it has a different error, in our case, for example, if the username is invalid, we display this other part, all right? And if you go back here, you see that is what the else part will actually do. And important thing, once again, I remind you, make sure that this part is actually true, so that these sections will actually be displayed. Let's test this out really quick. So changing these two to false, and then we go and then we test them out. So it was for the username field. We test this one out. We just say like, you see, nothing. The error will not be displayed, even if this field has an error. And if we check this in our HTML, it will be seen as false. this part will be seen as false. And if it's seen as false, then the condition will not be met and this content will not be displayed to the user. All right, so the email validator is the same. It's more and the same like the username validator. So we will not dwell much on this one. So that means we'll be jumping over to our password validator and see how it works behind the scenes and how it actually connects the independent checks, the steps that the user has actually met. The first thing you note, we have our parameter as form because we are receiving the whole form. Remember, we passed it as a validator for the whole form. That is why we are receiving it as the whole form. Then we expand this. We see that here from the form value, you remember our form value, which gives us the object of the form and the most recent state value of the form. Okay, so from this we will be picking the password as well as the confirm password because these are the only two things that we actually need. Okay, then you see here we have this object and this object is dynamic, which means that we can be able to index it, and we will see why that's important at the bottom. So all we are passing inside it is first of all whether the password is missing. By default, we are going to say whenever a user makes a change in the form, these two fields, the password as well as the confirm passwords, the return value for them will always be that they are invalid because remember this is reactive. So as a user interacts with the fields, the change has to also be reactive as well, which means that if the user enters a valid password, then no error will be returned. But if they enter an invalid password, then an error will be returned. And if the passwords do not match, an error will be returned. But if the passwords match, then no error will be returned. Okay, so let's see how these checks actually happen. The first check that we have is whether both passwords are provided. So we are going to say if password and confirm password, then that means that we have to say that the passwords are not missing and we have to update the value for the password missing from true to false. It's that easy. All right, so the same is also done for whether the passwords actually match. If the passwords match, then in that case, we just say false. The passwords do not match will be false and it will not be shown and the form will be valid. And then the next part is for all the other checks that we have. These are other checks for invalid length and so forth and so forth. Expanding this should give us this section right here. And one thing I want you to notice here, and it's actually just a summary, is that these checks, they are invalidating the defaults. What do I mean by that? We see that, for example, we have our invalid length key right here, okay? Then the check for the appropriate length is made here. So if the password length is greater than 8, that means the valid length has been met. All we need to do is to invalidate the default by setting it to false because it was true by default right here. The same goes for the uppercase. We check that if the password starts with an uppercase, we invalidate the default by setting it to false. And it's just that easy. The same goes for whether there is a symbol and also if the password has a number. So you can add as many checks as you want right here, is up to you. Finally, before we actually return an error or null, we have to make sure that in our password error, we iterate through the keys and check if there is a key, all right, that has a value of true. If that is the case, then we say that our password form has an error and we break. We don't need to proceed. And after that, this value, whatever it will be, if it is false, then we return null. But if it's true, then we return the password error. And that means that if a password error is returned, then our form will be invalid. However, if null is returned, then our form will be a valid one. So with that understanding in mind, let's now expand all the files that we are actually working with and see how all this connects. All right, starting off in our password validation checks, we see that we have declared our keys and labels right here for the validation checks. Then our app component will just loop through them and make the check that we need right here. All right. And now we connect them with our returned password error object right here. So you notice that in the app component HTML, we are checking from the sign up form whether it has an error, all right? And this error is a check.key, all right? Is a check.key. That means it will actually target specific keys. In this case, it can be invalid length and so forth. And we actually compare these to match the ones that we have specified here, because if we take a look at our loop right here, it's actually looping through them and then we check for the key, all right? And if that key is present, then we check for the false value. If it does not have an error, that is what that line means. If that specific key does not have an error, that means if it is false. And this will be based on the invalidations that we have made right here in this section. Okay, so if the criteria has been met, then the field will be deemed as valid and it will have the green display, which means that the user will actually know, okay, my password is okay, so I can proceed on to the next step. All right, so now let's test this out and see how they actually behave on the UI. So we start with our username. We say, if we add an invalid character, we see the error. Then for the email, and it's okay now. Then for the password, you can see it changes the display here as we are typing. Then we say here also, we see now because the passwords do not match, we see the error for passwords do not match. And that should be it. Then we become a member. We see our nice notification right here. And then if we inspect our console, we should see the whole object for our sign up form. And with that, you can see how easy it was to actually implement your custom validators in Angular Reactive Forms. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And as always, remember, you stop growing when you stop learning. And what you learn, go further and teach others that you may grow together. Okay? All right. Until the next one.